Before we step onto the ridge and into the cold breath of Roan Mountain, welcome to No Name, a place where real encounters from the deep woods are retold exactly as they were lived, unsettling, unpolished, and unforgettable. Every story here comes from those who walked into the wilderness seeking peace and found something waiting in the quiet. If you've ever had a night in the mountains that refused to leave your mind, or if you simply want more true encounters from the darkest corners of America's wild places, make sure you subscribe, share your own experiences in the comments, and help this community grow stronger with every story told. Now, breathe deep, listen closely, and let's begin. The first thing that struck me about Roan Mountain wasn't the cold or the thinning air or even the rolling fog that curled through the spruce like something alive. It was the way the silence felt trained, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath for something it didn't dare say out loud. My name is Ethan, 34 years old, born and raised not too far from the Tennessee-North Carolina line, the son of people who knew these ridges well enough to respect them, but never well enough to feel safe in them. I grew up on stories, whispered by locals who spoke of the Roan Highlands like they were a living thing that tested people, measured them, sometimes welcomed them, and sometimes didn't. But October of 2022 was the first time I returned alone, carrying only my pack, my tent, and the kind of restless fear that hums under your ribs when you know something in your life needs to change, but you haven't yet admitted it to yourself. I came because I thought the woods could quiet the noise in my head. I came because solitude felt like the only honest way to understand the parts of myself I kept avoiding. I came because the locals had always said Roan Mountain reveals truth. But the truth it gave me was nothing I expected, and nothing I have found language for until now. It was supposed to be a simple overnight trip along the ridge, camping near the stretch where the Appalachian Balds open into sweeping views that make you feel impossibly small. I wanted stillness. Instead, I found a question that still follows me. What do you do when the wilderness speaks back? The hike up was bright, deceptively peaceful. Maples turning red, the wind steady but soft, the sky the kind of blue that hides every warning. I passed two older hikers from a local club, both from Carter County, and they told me what locals always say when outsiders camp on the ridge. Weather changes quick up there. Fog will roll in like it was chasing somebody. I laughed politely, but I felt it. A subtle pressure in the air, the kind that makes your instincts sharpen, even when your mind insists you're overreacting. As days slipped into late afternoon, I set my tent near the tree line where spruce and fir formed a dark, jagged wall behind me. The wind carried the scent of cold earth and decaying needles, familiar, grounding, almost comforting. For a moment, I felt exactly what I came for. The quiet, the breathing space, the sense that the world had finally stopped shouting. But Roan Mountain doesn't stay quiet for long. It began with the strange stillness, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like a held inhale. No birdsong, no rustle, no distant hum of hikers on the trail, just a dense, unnatural hush spreading across the ridge as if someone had lowered a glass dome over the world. I remember tightening my jacket and scanning the tree line, not for animals, but for understanding. My grandmother used to say that when the woods go silent, it means something is moving that shouldn't be. And standing there on the ridge, I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck exactly the way it did when I was a child, listening to her stories by lantern light. I tried to shake the feeling off. Started a small stove, boiled water, watched the fog begin to snake around the spruces. October fog on the ridge is normal, fast, thick, rolling in like it's been waiting behind an invisible door. But this fog moved differently. It drifted low and slow, as if following the curves of the land with purpose, not pushed by wind, but guided by something unseen. I remember thinking it looked almost like a gathering, like the mountain was calling something home. The first voice came just after dusk, faint, directionless, a whisper carried on the wind that didn't sound like wind, a tone, not a word, a human rhythm, a breath that did not belong to me. I froze, my hands still wrapped around my metal mug. For a moment, I thought maybe another hiker had set up camp nearby, but the ridge was empty. I had watched it empty. I had listened to it empty. And the sound came from the spruce line behind me, deep in the dark where no tent lights flickered, no footsteps crunched, no human presence existed. I told myself it was the wind weaving through the needles. But a few minutes later, the whisper came again, longer this time, rising and falling like someone was trying to speak through cloth. Not loud, not close, but unmistakably human. The kind of whisper that makes your spine tighten with recognition before reason catches up. The fog thickened until the world became a pocket of pale gray, and somewhere within that gray came a second voice, lighter, almost overlapping the first. Two tones, two distinct breaths, two presences. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I just listened, every instinct screaming at me to get inside the tent, zip it closed, and pretend the thin walls could protect me from whatever watched through the fog. But I'd camped in strange places before. I knew the difference between fear rooted in imagination and fear rooted in awareness. This was the latter. When the voices stopped, the silence that followed felt expectant, as if the mountain were waiting for something from me. My heart hammered so loud I swore the sound was echoing off the trees. Night settled heavy across the ridge, smothering the last of the light, and the cold crept in with the kind of bite that makes you feel suddenly, terrifyingly mortal. I forced myself into the tent, zipped the door, and convinced myself nothing could get close without the brush of branches or the crunch of boots giving it away. I wish that had been true. It must have been close to midnight when I heard footsteps, not animal, not soft, but slow, dragging human steps circling the tent. My breath stopped. The air inside the tent felt instantly too thin, my chest tight, my pulse sharp with panic. The steps paused directly behind my head, and the whisper I heard then wasn't drifting or distant. It was inches away, muffled only by nylon and the thinnest layer of air. A low murmur, impossible to understand, but unmistakably directed at me. And then another voice joined it, on the opposite side of the tent. Two voices, two sets of footsteps, two presences moving just beyond the thin barrier separating me from whatever had come out of the fog. My mind raced. Wild, disoriented thoughts about hikers lost in the mountain, about stories I'd heard of spirits wandering the Roan Balds, about the mountain's long history of disappearances spoken about only in quiet, cautious tones. I lay perfectly still, afraid that even the sound of my breath might draw their attention closer. The voices circled, sometimes whispering in unison, sometimes overlapping in strange, broken rhythms, not chanting, not calling, but speaking in a cadence that felt wrong, like a language made of breath and sorrow. When they finally stopped, the silence hit harder than the whispers, and then the ridge went dark, so dark the inside of the tent felt like a sealed tomb. The darkness wasn't natural. It was too complete, too suffocating, as if the fog itself had swallowed every trace of moonlight. I lay there, frozen in that black void, listening for anything, movement, breath, the shift of weight outside the tent, but the world had gone impossibly still. A stillness that didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. I had the overwhelming sensation that if I unzipped the tent even an inch, something would be waiting on the other side. Something with patience. Something that had all night. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time stretches strangely when fear rewires your senses. I remember counting my breaths to stay grounded, 1, 2, 3, trying to steady the panic tightening inside my chest. The locals always said the mountains could sense a person's state of mind, that fear was an invitation. And lying there, trembling in a tent no thicker than a jacket, I believed them more than I ever had in my life. Then came the tapping, a faint, rhythmic tap, like a fingertip brushing the fabric. Once, then twice. Then again with a slow, deliberate cadence that made my skin crawl. It started near my feet, then shifted to my left side, then my right, as if something was feeling around the tent, tracing its shape, mapping where I lay inside. Each tap sent a cold jolt through me, a reminder that the thin barrier separating me from the outside world wasn't protection. It was a veil, fragile and meaningless. I pressed my hands flat to the sleeping pad, willing myself not to move or make a sound. The air felt colder with every passing second, creeping up from the ground like frost forming beneath my skin. Somewhere in the fog, far from the tent but close enough to hear, came a single long exhale, a breath that didn't belong to anything human anymore. Not a whisper this time, but a sigh that carried weight. Grief, weariness, something old and wounded. My grandmother used to tell me that some mountains hold onto the voices of people who never made it out, that their last breaths echo through the ridges on nights when the fog is thick enough to touch. But what I heard outside that tent didn't feel like memory. It felt like presence, something aware, something searching. The tapping stopped. For a full minute, there was no sound at all. Then, from right behind my head, through the nylon and darkness, came a voice, clearer than before, shaped enough to almost resemble words, but warped like breath forced through cracked lips, a low, drawn-out whisper that sounded like, "Come home." Every hair on my body rose, my heart slammed so hard it hurt, and for a moment, a horrifying, disorienting moment, I felt an emotion I still struggle to explain. Not fear, not confusion, but recognition. A pull. As if something in that voice reached inside the deepest part of me and tugged on a thread I didn't know existed. As if the mountain wasn't calling me to leave, but to join it. I don't know how long I lay there after the whisper faded. I don't know when the tapping stopped or when the fog lightened, but I remember the moment I realized the voices were gone because the wind returned. A soft, natural rustle through the spruce. A sound I'd taken for granted all my life suddenly felt like salvation. Only then did I force myself to sit up, unzip the tent, and let my head breach the cold morning air. At first I thought dawn had broken early, but it wasn't dawn. It was the fog glowing from the rising sun somewhere above its thinning layers. The world around me looked washed in silver, gentle and silent again, as if the horrors of the night had dissolved with the darkness. There were no footprints outside the tent, no drag marks, no evidence of anything circling the perimeter. Just the faint shimmer of frost that had formed on the guy lines and the faint indentation of someone having stood near the spruce line. Not a track, just a presence in the shape of disturbed needles and bent grass. I packed up quickly, hands shaking more than I cared to admit. The trail back down the ridge felt unfamiliar, even though I'd walked it just the day before. The trees seemed taller, the air heavier, the silence deeper. It felt like Roan Mountain was watching me leave, and that if I slowed down, even for a moment, I might hear that whisper again, that impossible, mournful invitation. When I finally reached the trailhead, I found a local ranger locking up one of the maintenance sheds. He looked at me, really looked, and asked if I'd camped on the ridge overnight. I nodded. His expression tightened in a way that made my stomach drop. "You picked a bad night for it," he said quietly. "Fog was thick enough to lose yourself in. Happens around this time every year. Folks say the voices get louder in October." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know, but he kept talking, almost like he needed to say it out loud. "People hear things up there, breath-like sounds, whispering. Some say it's the wind in the spruce. Others think it's the ones who never made it off the mountain. Hard to say what's true. But we tell hikers not to camp alone in heavy fog. Ridge plays tricks on the mind." He paused, glanced up the trail, then added something that chilled me more than the night itself. "Tricks or not, the voices don't talk to everybody." Even now, I don't know what he meant. I don't know why the whispers came to me or why they circled my tent like they knew exactly where I was lying. But I do know this. Roan Mountain didn't want to scare me, not really. It wanted to mark me, to remind me that some places hold stories older than our fears and older than our understanding. And ever since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something on that ridge whispered not because it was trapped, but because it wanted company. I've learned that the deepest fear doesn't always begin with a scream. Sometimes it begins with the sound of your own heartbeat, echoing in a place so quiet that even the trees seem to be holding their breath. My name is Daniel, 31 years old at the time, and in July of 2021, I thought I understood the woods of Pisgah National Forest. I had hiked its ridgelines, camped beside its rivers, and even spent nights alone beneath its canopy. But familiarity, I would soon learn, is not the same as safety, and nothing prepares you for the moment the forest decides to turn its gaze toward you. I arrived with the simple intention of taking a solo weekend trip to clear my head, setting up camp at a dispersed site not far from Yellow Gap Road, a place the locals said was peaceful, so long as you keep your wits about you. At the time, I thought they were being playful. Only later would I understand that what they said was less a warning and more a plea. The first day slipped by like a warm breath of summer, sun filtering through leaves, the distant rush of creeks swelling with afternoon rain, the quiet satisfaction of watching smoke curl from a small fire. I'd grown up around stories from Southern hikers, whispers about strange cries in the distance, shadowy silhouettes skirting the tree line, and the old, lingering belief that the woods remember everything. But I'd never been one to let stories shake me. I believed in the tangible, tracks in the mud, weather patterns, the behavioral habits of animals. Still, as the sun dipped lower, the forest around me took on that peculiar stillness that feels too deliberate, too synchronized, as if everything living had agreed to hold still for reasons it refused to share. By twilight, a faint mist gathered across the underbrush, softening the ground into a pale haze. I sat near the fire ring, listening to the hiss and crackle of flames when I first noticed something, the subtle sensation that I was no longer alone. It wasn't noise at first. It was a shift in pressure, the way the atmosphere thickened, cloaking the campsite like a shiver along the skin of the earth. I tried to brush it off as the usual unease of the first night alone, especially deep in Pisgah where the ridges echo with old sounds. But then came the smell. Damp soil, turned recently by something heavy, fresh, close. I glanced out into the woods, searching for movement, but saw nothing except the slow drift of smoke weaving through the darkening branches. I told myself it was probably a deer or a black bear wandering through. July is active season for them. I'd dealt with wildlife before, but what unsettled me wasn't the possibility of an animal. It was the feeling that whatever watched me wasn't moving like one. No twigs snapped, no brush rustled. It was silent in a way that did not belong to anything living on four legs. So I added more wood to the fire, watching orange sparks shoot upward like fireflies desperate to escape the coming night. And as the forest swallowed the final traces of daylight, I made a mistake I didn't recognize then. I let the fire burn a little too low. Darkness settled in thick and heavy, the kind that smothers your sense of distance. I was sitting near the fire ring, poking at the embers when it came, the first sound, a single footstep, deliberate, slow, so close to the fire ring that the vibration almost traveled through the dirt beneath my boots. I froze, holding my breath, listening hard as the air tightened like a knot inside my chest. A second step followed, then a third. Not fast, not aggressive, but measured, like someone circling the edge of the fire's dying light. Every hair along my arms rose, and the forest around me felt suddenly colder, as if the night itself leaned in to listen. I whispered into the dark, "Who's there?" My voice cracked slightly, thin as the smoke above me. No response. Only the faint shuffle of weight, shifting from one foot to another, pacing just beyond the boundary of the dim light. My mind raced through explanations, maybe a lost hiker passing through, though no hiker moves without a flashlight at night. Maybe wildlife again, though no animal walks in slow, even footsteps in a perfect arc around a campsite. And maybe it was human, which in the woods can be far worse than any creature. I stood slowly, reaching for the hatchet near my tent, every muscle trembling with the instinctive awareness that something was terribly wrong. The footsteps stopped the moment I moved. Silence washed over the forest again, but this time it felt predatory, as if I'd been caught reacting, revealing too much. I stepped closer to the fire, nudging the wood to spark more light, desperate to push back the dark. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow, tall, slender, unmoving, just inside the tree line. My heart slammed against my ribs, and every warning I'd ever heard from locals came rushing back. In Pisgah, it's not always the animals you need to worry about. Sometimes it's what pretends to be human. I blinked once, twice, trying to force the shadow into clarity. But every time the fire shifted, the silhouette shifted with it, growing longer, narrowing, then dissipating entirely when I dared to stare directly at it. I felt the night pushing in on me, pressing against my breath, forcing me to acknowledge a truth I didn't want to face. I was being watched with intention, with patience, by something that understood my fear better than I did. The forest felt older in that moment, wiser, as if the ground beneath my boots held memories of nights like this. Nights where someone heard footsteps around their fire ring and realized too late they were not alone. I tightened my grip on the hatchet and backed toward my tent, the fire throwing long, twitching shadows across the clearing. I didn't want to turn my back on the tree line, but the instinct to protect myself was stronger than logic. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the summer air was warm. And just as I reached the tent, the footsteps started again, faster this time, closer, circling me in a tightening ring of sound that made my pulse roar in my ears. I spun around, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing, only the trembling shimmer of heat from the fire, warping the world into a shifting blur. Then, from the dark, came a sound I will never forget, a low exhale, close enough to the back of my neck that I felt the warmth of it skim my skin. Not an animal's breath. Not the grunt of a deer or the snort of a bear. This exhale had shape, intention, almost curiosity. I whipped around, swinging the hatchet blindly, but my blade cut only empty air. The footsteps retreated instantly, melting back into the woods as if whatever stalked me had simply stepped backward into the night. I staggered toward the fire, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and fed it every piece of wood I had. Flames roared upward, bright and furious, chasing the shadows back long enough for me to breathe again. But even with the fire blazing high, I felt no comfort, only the bitter understanding that something had been inches from me, studying me, deciding whether or not to strike. I stayed by the fire because it was the only thing with a pulse besides my own. Flames snapped sharply upward as if warning me not to drift too far from their reach. My breath was shallow, uneven, but I forced myself to sit, to steady my shaking hands, to pretend, if only for a moment, that the circle of light could still protect me. And as the fire grew stronger, the woods grew quieter, almost resentful, as though something had slipped back into the darkness to wait for another opportunity. That was when the true fear settled in. Not the instinctive spike of panic, not the shock of footsteps beside the fire ring, but the realization that whatever had been circling me wasn't gone. It was simply patient, and patience in the deep woods is never a gift. It is a hunt. I tried to focus on the fire, on its warmth, its glow, its way of cracking open the night like a refuge carved from flame and desperation. But every time the wind shifted, the smoke blew sideways and revealed glimpses of the woods beyond, empty patches between pines that looked too empty, too still, as if something was hiding just out of sight, tilting its head, listening for the rhythm of my breathing. I kept telling myself that if I could just make it to dawn, I'd be fine. That the light would return everything to normal. That whatever walked those nighttime shadows would retreat the moment the sun touched the forest floor. But I knew, deep in the part of me that still carries childhood instincts, that this wasn't the kind of presence that cared about sunrise. And slowly, a quiet truth hit me like cold water against bare skin. The footsteps didn't belong to something passing by. They belonged to something that knew I was coming. Something that had waited. My thoughts drifted to the locals I'd spoken to weeks earlier, old-timers from Brevard who'd warned me, half joking, half not, about the Watchers in Pisgah. Mountain folklore, they'd called it. Stories about tall shapes that roamed just beyond lantern light. Figures that paced around campsites but never stepped fully into view. "They're older than this soil," one man said, tapping the ash from his cigarette. "Older than the Cherokee stories. Older than anything that has a name." I'd laughed then, thinking he was simply leaning into the mystique the Appalachian Mountains were known for. But now, staring into the dark with shaking breaths, I wasn't laughing. I wasn't even sure the man had been exaggerating. The wind died, leaving the forest breathless once more. And then it happened. Something small, something almost delicate. A stick snapped, directly behind my tent. My heart stuttered. Slowly, I stood, the hatchet still in my hand, holding it tight enough to make the wood bite into my palm. The sound hadn't come from far away, not from the tree line or the distance. It had come from the very edge of my campsite, no more than 10 feet behind me, hidden by the fabric of my tent and the thick brush beyond it. I turned, inch by inch, expecting to see a shadow shift, a figure lean forward, eyes reflecting firelight. But nothing moved. Not a leaf. Not a branch. The kind of stillness that makes your stomach drop, because silence after a sound that close is worse than a series of noises. It means whatever made the sound is aware of you and waiting for your next move. I swallowed hard, feeling sweat bead along the back of my neck. "If it's a person," I whispered under my breath, "just speak." But the woods held their silence like a clenched fist. No voice answered, and that was somehow worse than the sound itself. A human with bad intentions would have laughed, taunted, or moved again. A bear would have snorted or shuffled. A deer would have fled. But this, whatever this was, chose stillness, chose silence, chose to let fear do the work for it. The fire roared behind me, but I barely felt its heat. Every instinct screamed for me to retreat into the tent and zip it shut, but the idea of turning my back, of crouching with only a thin layer of nylon between me and whatever was out there, felt like asking to be dragged out by my ankles. So I stepped closer to the tent instead, scanning the ground, the brush, the sliver of darkness where the trees began their old, dense march toward the mountains. And then I saw it, barely, faintly, like a shape carved from deeper dark. A figure standing just beyond the last curve of firelight. Tall, too tall, shoulders narrow, posture unnaturally straight. It didn't sway like a creature, didn't nod or breathe or shift. It simply stood as though placed there to watch. I felt the air leave my lungs in a thin, broken exhale. For the first time that night, I wasn't sure if my fear was making me see it, or if my fear was finally allowing me to. I lifted the hatchet slightly, though it felt pitifully small. The figure didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge me in any human way. And then, slowly, with a fluid motion that chilled me deeper than the mountain air, it stepped backward, not turned, not pivoted. Just glided one step into the darkness until its outline dissolved completely, leaving my eyes searching an empty void. My pulse hammered as I backed up to the fire, feeling absurdly like a child retreating from the closet in his bedroom. Flames snapped and spit as if urging me to feed them again, to keep them alive, because the fire knew something I didn't, or something I didn't want to accept. I dropped to my knees and threw on more wood until the sparks rose like tiny spirits fleeing the earth. My emotional conflict twisted deeper. Was the fire protecting me? Or was it the only thing making me visible to whatever lurked beyond its glow? And the worst part wasn't that something had circled me, or stood 10 feet from my tent, or watched me with the silence of a predator waiting for its moment. The worst part was realizing that whatever it was knew I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not until it decided the night was done with me. The fire's glow felt thinner by the minute, even though the flames rose tall and wild. It was as if the night pressed itself closer, testing the boundaries of the light, tasting its edges. I sat there with my knees pulled tight, hatchet still in hand, breathing through the slow, suffocating weight of knowing the forest was studying me. Not attacking, not retreating. Just watching with a patience that stripped away every illusion I'd carried into these mountains. The minutes dragged like hours. Every small sound, a shifting ash, a drip of condensation falling from a leaf, sent a jolt through me. But the woods remained unnervingly silent. No insects, no owls, no movement. A silence like that doesn't happen naturally. It happens when something older, something dominant, demands it. I don't remember closing my eyes, even for a second. But I do remember the moment I realized I wasn't alone inside the firelight. It started with the faintest sound. Not a step, not a breath, but the quiet drag of something across soil. A subtle shift of weight. I turned my head slightly, and my stomach dropped. Because there, on the opposite side of the fire ring, the darkness seemed wrong. Thicker, weighted, like a figure stood just beyond the flames, so still it might have been carved out of the night itself. I couldn't make out its features, but I felt a presence there, a pressure, a coldness, a certainty that my instincts weren't imagining anything. My first reaction wasn't to scream or run or even stand. It was something quieter, something more animal. My breath caught, and I leaned forward like prey caught in a hunter's gaze. My mind didn't need to see a face to understand the threat. Every fiber in my body felt it. Something wanted me afraid. Not fleeing, not fighting. Just afraid. Because fear is a kind of offering in the deep woods. A currency, and something out there wanted to collect. The figure didn't move at first. It just remained there, absorbing the heat of the fire but never stepping into it. I stared for what felt like an eternity, my vision blurring at the edges, just waiting for a sign of intent, waiting for it to step closer, waiting for something human that might tell me I had misread everything. But this figure, this presence, didn't behave like anything I could understand. It tilted its shape slightly, as if listening to the tremble in my breath. And then, in one fluid shift, it moved, slow, deliberate, gliding sideways through the dark until the fire no longer illuminated its edges. That movement, graceful, silent, unnatural, broke something inside me. My breath hitched, my chest tightened. Panic clawed through me, cold and electric. I scrambled backward until my shoulders hit the side of my tent. I wanted to run. God! Every instinct screamed to run. But where? Into the woods where this thing had been circling me? Down the mountain in pitch-black darkness with roots and ravines waiting to swallow me whole? The thought of leaving the fire's glow felt like stepping into the mouth of something waiting. So I stayed. I sat there with adrenaline shaking through my bones, staring at a patch of darkness where the figure had vanished. Minutes passed, slow, excruciating minutes, until at last the forest made a noise. A low creaking groan, not a tree, not wind, a sound like weight shifting somewhere deep in the brush. Then another, then nothing. It stayed that way for hours. The fire burned low again despite everything I fed it. My limbs were numb, my throat was tight with dryness, and then finally, mercifully, the first pale light began to bleed through the canopy. Dawn. The moment that should have brought relief, warmth, clarity. But as the sky brightened and the forest regained its voice, something unbearable twisted in my gut. Because there, in the soft morning light, I saw the ground around my campsite, disturbed in a full circle, as if something had walked the perimeter over and over. No prints, no tracks, just disturbed soil evenly spaced, encircling everything like a ritual boundary. And behind my tent, the place where I'd heard the stick snap, the soil was overturned in a wide single mark. Not a footprint, not a paw print. Just a long, smooth impression, as if something had crouched low, watching me, waiting. Close enough to touch the tent fabric if it wanted. My emotional dilemma sharpened into something brutal and honest. I wasn't afraid of dying in those woods. I was afraid of not understanding what had stalked me, afraid of what it wanted, afraid that some part of it had followed me out of Pisgah, lingering in the edges of my memory like cold breath on the back of my neck. I broke camp with shaking hands, stuffing gear into my pack with frantic movements. Every moment felt like a gamble. The light was rising, yes, but the forest still felt wrong, as if something watched from behind every tree trunk. I didn't look back, not once. I walked fast, then faster, then nearly jogging down the trail until the road came into view. Only when I reached the safety of my car did I finally let my breath collapse from my lungs in uneven waves. But even as I drove away, the feeling wouldn't leave me. The sense of being watched, the pressure between my shoulder blades, the echo of those silent, deliberate footsteps around the fire ring, steps that no human, no animal could replicate so precisely. And here's the truth I've carried since that night, the truth that keeps me awake sometimes when the house settles after dark. The woods don't always show you everything. Sometimes they show you just enough to let your imagination fill in the teeth. But in Pisgah, on that July night, they showed me something real, something alive, something patient. And I know, deep in my bones, that whatever circled my campsite wasn't passing through. It was guarding something older than I can understand or hunting something unlucky enough to end up alone by a fire in the dead of night. The lesson I carry is simple, carved into me like a scar. Respect the dark, respect the silence, respect the woods that watch you back. Because once you've heard footsteps at midnight in a place like Pisgah, you never truly camp alone again. I never thought a single camping trip could strip me down to the raw edges of fear and wonder. The kind of fear that doesn't just make your heart race, but makes you question the very shape of the night around you. My name is Alex, I'm 32, and I've been drawn to the Appalachian Mountains for years. Not for the fame of their trails, not for Instagram-worthy sunrises, but for the solitude, the silent communion with the forests where shadows breathe like living things. That May, in 2020, I decided to tackle Old Rag in Shenandoah, Virginia, a ridge known for its jagged cliffs and labyrinthine trails. The locals whispered about strange lights, unexplainable noises, but I dismissed it as folklore, the kind of stories seasoned hikers trade over campfires. I packed my Volkswagen camper with all the essentials, a sturdy tent, warm sleeping bag, headlamp, and a notebook to record my thoughts, and I set out alone, seeking the kind of isolation that makes the mind both lucid and fragile. The hike started as it always does, deceptively ordinary. The early morning air was crisp, damp with the scent of pine and wet earth, birds calling to one another across the canopy. I remember the sunlight filtering through the trees, each ray illuminating the moss like tiny lanterns suspended in the air. There was an ease to my steps, a rhythm that comes from familiarity, but as I ascended, the forest began to shift imperceptibly. The birds fell silent. The wind no longer carried a soft whisper. It was a subtle, deliberate pressure against the skin, like the forest itself was exhaling. Around midday, I reached a small clearing near a rock ledge. I paused to drink water, to take in the expanse of green and gray, and that's when I first saw it, a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing gently between the trees far below the ridge I was on. My first instinct was logic. Hikers. Someone had stayed late, wandered the lower paths, but there was no sound, no footsteps, only the occasional rustle of leaves. It didn't move like a human. It slid, almost floated between the trunks, as if the shadows themselves were carrying it. I shrugged off the unease and continued, trying to convince myself that fear was a luxury for the unprepared. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to reorganize itself around that light. Every time I stopped, it would appear again, sometimes closer, sometimes just at the edge of perception, teasing the corner of my eye. My rational mind searched for patterns. Maybe an animal with luminescent eyes, maybe the trick of early evening fog catching the last sun, but nothing fit. My heart began to pound with a rhythm that matched the flicker of the light, and I realized with a creeping horror that I was being followed, not in the sense of a hiker behind me, but in a predatory, calculating way, the forest itself acting as a conduit. As darkness fell, the path became treacherous. Rocks slick with dampness, gnarled roots that clutched at my boots, branches that seemed to reach out with intent. I set up camp in a small clearing, my lantern casting long, trembling shadows. I tried to write down my thoughts, but the words came in jerks, fragmented by an anxiety that felt almost tactile. And then the lantern appeared, this time closer than ever, glowing faintly in the gloom beyond the firelight. I could see the trees bending around it, but no source. My mind screamed, "It's a hiker, a prank." But every instinct in my body told me otherwise. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice cracked in the cold air, swallowed by the vast, echoing silence of the ridge. I realized then that the fear was not just in what I might see, but in the unspoken question. What is this? And why does it follow? I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, headlamp off, staring into the darkness. The lantern moved again, drifting along the edge of my clearing. I held my breath as it paused, this as if considering me, studying, waiting. I remember feeling a weight, a moral dilemma that gnawed at the edges of my fear. Should I leave, retreat down the trail in total darkness, or confront the unknown? The decision seemed both trivial and impossible. My rational mind argued for safety, but my curiosity, the same force that had brought me to Old Rag alone, would not relent. I whispered into the night, unsure if the forest would hear me, if the light was a consciousness or merely a trick of nature. The air thickened. I could feel the presence of something old, something patient, something neither cruel nor kind, simply aware. By dawn, the fog rolled in like a tide, thickening the shadows, blurring the light into ghostly streaks. I began to descend, keeping the lantern in view, tracking its movement. It led me in strange loops, sometimes retreating when I approached, sometimes hovering closer when I tried to avoid it. The climb back down the ridge became less about speed and more about observation, understanding, negotiation with an entity that seemed to occupy the threshold between the natural and the inexplicable. At one point, I slipped on a mossy rock and nearly fell, but the lantern shifted abruptly to my side, illuminating a safe path I had not noticed before. It wasn't guidance in a friendly sense. It was a test, a challenge, an acknowledgement of my presence. I realized then that my terror was entwined with awe. It was not just fear of harm, but fear of not comprehending something larger than myself. Hours later, when I finally broke through the thick undergrowth and reached the trailhead, the light vanished as if it had never existed. I was exhausted, every muscle trembling, but also inexplicably alive. That single night, alone on Old Rag, taught me something beyond the standard lessons of camping: preparation, caution, and skill. It taught me about humility, about recognizing that the world holds mysteries that no trail map, headlamp, or survival guide can explain. That light, that persistent, drifting lantern, was not a warning, not a threat. It was a mirror of the part of myself that seeks, that ventures, that cannot resist the allure of the unknown. I left Shenandoah changed. The forest shadows, once merely dark and quiet, now carried a voice I could not forget. And in every solitary hike since, when the sun dips below the peaks and shadows stretch long and deep, I feel the echo of that lantern. It stalks not to harm, but to remind, to haunt, to teach that fear and curiosity are not enemies, but companions on the path into the wilderness, companions that demand both respect and courage. Each time I camp under the stars, I remember that night. The way the light moved like consciousness, patient and observant. I remember the choices I made, the hesitation, the courage, the clarity born from confronting the unknown alone. And in that remembrance, I find a kind of inspiration, an urging to step beyond fear, to honor the wilderness, to carry its lessons into every step, every breath, every whispered story I pass along to those who, like me, are drawn to the deep woods, not for comfort, but for transformation. The descent from Old Rag did not bring the relief I had anticipated. The light, once a distant, eerie guide, now seemed to hover in memory, trailing me like a shadow stitched into my mind. The forest's shape had changed overnight. Trees I had passed confidently now appeared twisted. Their roots knotted into forms that suggested eyes watching, mouths waiting, a silent audience to my fear. I tried to reason with myself, to insist it was exhaustion, imagination, the mind's natural trick when deprived of rest and overwhelmed by the vastness of wilderness. Yet every step echoed against the unseen, and every shadow seemed to flicker with a life of its own. The rational part of me urged speed, urged safety, but the other part, the part that had lingered near the clearing hours before, heart pounding as the lantern drifted, refused to let go of the invisible thread that bound me to that light. By late morning, my legs ached. My hands were raw from gripping rocks and roots, yet I could not stop glancing over my shoulder, expecting, in some irrational primal way, to see the lantern again. It did not appear, not physically, but its presence lingered in the rustle of leaves, the intermittent gusts that carried the smell of wet soil and moss deep into my lungs. I became hyper-aware of every sound, a snapping branch, the faint hiss of a small creature, the wind brushing against the ridges. Each moment was a duel between fear and fascination, between the instinct to flee and the compulsion to witness. I understood then that the terror I had felt the night before was not born of danger alone. It was a confrontation with the unknown in its purest form, a confrontation with forces that cannot be quantified, categorized, or controlled. Hours passed, though time itself felt elastic, stretched and warped by the tension of what I could not see. I reached a narrow ledge that overlooked a deep valley, clouds drifting like ghosts below, and I paused, breathless not just from exertion but from the sudden, overwhelming beauty and isolation of the scene. It was in that suspended silence that I first felt it fully. The lantern was not merely a light, it was an awareness, a consciousness threading the forest together, patient and eternal. My fear became tinged with reverence. I realized I was not just a hiker in these woods. I was a visitor, an intruder into a space that had existed long before me and would continue long after. The thought shook me deeper than any imagined monster ever could. I felt small, vulnerable, alive in a way I had never allowed myself to feel in my busy, predictable life outside the mountains. By mid-afternoon, I emerged from the dense thicket onto a familiar trailhead. The presence of the lantern was gone, but its impact lingered like the afterimage of a light pressed into the retina. My body was exhausted, my mind still restless, but there was a new clarity inside me, a recognition that fear, when faced directly and without denial, could teach, not just warn. I thought back to every misstep I had taken, every slip on moss, every miscalculated move near the cliffs, and I realized that survival was not merely a matter of skill, but of attentiveness, humility, and understanding the limits of one's knowledge. That night on Old Rag had stripped me of arrogance, of the belief that I could control or predict the wilderness, and replaced it with a quiet, enduring respect. Even as I drove away in my Volkswagen camper, the mountains receded but did not vanish. The memory of the lantern lingered, persistent and silent, a testament to the forest's hidden depths. Over the following days, I revisited my notes, trying to describe the light, the sensation of being watched yet guided, the subtle moral tension that had twisted itself through my fear. Words failed, as words often do when faced with something that cannot be fully comprehended. But the attempt itself was a ritual, a way to honor the experience without diminishing it. I realized that some truths of the wilderness cannot be captured in maps, pictures, or stories. They can only be lived, absorbed, and remembered. And so every time I hike, every time I camp in the Appalachian wilderness, I carry a piece of that night with me. The lantern is a quiet presence in my memory, a reminder that the woods are not empty, that fear and beauty exist side by side, and that the unknown is not always a threat, but a teacher. I've come to understand that the heart of these encounters is not the shock, the adrenaline, or even the immediate danger. It is the profound confrontation with mystery, the realization that the world extends beyond human comprehension, and that our place within it is both fragile and sacred. When I tell this story, I do not embellish, I do not dramatize. I simply speak from the truth of that night. The lantern may have been a trick of the eye, a natural phenomenon, or something beyond explanation. But its lesson remains. The wilderness is alive, patient, and infinitely complex, and those who enter it must do so with humility, awareness, and a willingness to be transformed. The fear I felt on Old Rag is not the kind that leaves you shaken for days and then disappears. It is the kind that changes you, reshapes your understanding of yourself, of the world, of the thin line between the known and the unknowable. Even now, Months later, when I close my eyes at night, I see that light drifting between the trees, faint but unmistakable, a guide and a challenge. It reminds me that the mountains are not just terrain to be conquered, trails to be mapped, or peaks to be photographed. They are living stories, and sometimes when you are alone enough to notice, they reach back to you. They remind you of your smallness, your courage, your curiosity, and the delicate, eternal dance between fear and wonder that defines every step into the deep woods. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of my Volkswagen camper that evening was the silence, a hollow, expectant quiet that seemed to weigh down every branch and stone around Red River Gorge. My name is Elias, I'm 32, and I've spent most of my adult life chasing the forest's pulse, the way it makes your heart adjust its rhythm to something older, something untamed. I had arrived at my usual spot near the gorge's edge, a place locals whisper about in half-joking tones, a place where the wind moves differently, where the cliffs have their own echoes, and where nights are long, longer than the calendar would suggest. November in Kentucky brings a chill that cuts through the layers of fabric, but also a kind of clarity. Colors sharpen, shadows deepen, and the air tastes like a warning you can almost swallow. The day had been deceptively ordinary. I hiked the narrow trails that wind between the sandstone cliffs, stepping carefully over roots slick with damp leaves, listening to the occasional snap of a twig that could either be an animal or someone else walking these paths in secret. A crow lifted abruptly into the cold sky, its wings slicing through the gray light, and I felt that familiar shiver, the thrill of isolation and the uneasy knowledge that the forest watches, always. By evening, I had returned to my campsite, a flat stretch overlooking a shallow ravine where the wind seemed to gather, twisting itself into a howl as it raced through the rock formations. Setting up my little stove and brewing coffee, I thought the night would be quiet, just the natural music of wind, leaves, and distant water, but something in the air told me otherwise. It started subtly at first. The wind, already alive, began to make a sound that wasn't quite natural, like a low, guttural scream threading itself between the cliffs. My first thought was a trick of the gorge, an echo caught between walls of stone, but it didn't stop. It shifted, moved, rose and fell in a rhythm almost conversational, almost human. I froze mid-sip, holding the metal mug close to my lips, feeling the warmth leak into my frozen hands. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just me, the wind, my imagination, or perhaps the isolation twisting my nerves, but then I heard it again, unmistakable, deliberate. A scream, raw and unearthly, cutting through the night. I hadn't planned to be alone in the woods that far into November, but life often pushes us to test limits we didn't know we had. My only companion was the small hum of my camp lantern, casting long shadows that danced over the rocks, making them seem like the bent limbs of something watching. I told myself it was just the gorge, that it had always been loud this time of year. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The sound didn't obey the terrain. It moved too quickly, darted through the trees like it had purpose. I couldn't pinpoint a source, yet it felt close, impossibly close, as if the gorge itself had leaned forward to whisper its ancient disapproval. Instinct overrode hesitation. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the camper, boots crunching over frost-bitten leaves, scanning the dark for signs of life. The scream, or what I was now certain was a scream, had stopped, leaving a vacuum of silence that was somehow worse than the noise. My mind raced through possibilities. An injured animal, a prankster, someone lost, or something I couldn't name. The gorge was notorious for accidents, and even seasoned hikers vanished in ways that defied explanation. My pulse raced. I thought about retreating to the safety of my locked camper, but the curiosity that keeps people like me wandering into the wilds was too strong. I followed the edge of the ravine, letting the light cut swaths into the darkness, each beam revealing the familiar contours of rock and tree, yet everything felt distorted, larger and stranger than it should have been. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and then I noticed movement. A figure, or a shadow that mimicked a figure, darted across the far side of the ravine, too fast to be human, yet the silhouette was humanoid, elongated, impossibly thin. My mouth went dry, hands trembling on the flashlight. I called out, voice cracking, "Hello? Anyone there?" The echo returned my words warped, a mocking mimic of human speech, followed instantly by the scream that had first drawn me here. This time, I couldn't rationalize it. It wasn't carried by wind. It was directed, measured, as if someone or something wanted me to hear it, wanted me to understand that I had trespassed on territory that didn't belong to the living. I backpedaled slowly, my eyes straining to adjust, scanning for landmarks to guide me back. That's when I noticed the wind itself had changed. No longer rushing, no longer just moving. It was bending, folding in on itself, swirling around me in audible spirals like it had a voice of its own. The sound was maddening, a chorus of groans, shrieks, and whispers that seemed to emerge from every direction at once. I could feel the pressure in my chest, an invisible weight pressing down, yet I couldn't stop moving. My instincts screamed, run, hide, get out. But each step felt like it had purpose, like the gorge itself was guiding me, shaping the path, forcing me towards something I couldn't yet see. Eventually, I reached a narrow trail that I recognized from earlier in the day, a path that should have led back to my camper in less than 10 minutes. But the forest had changed. The trees were denser, shadows longer, and the fog rolling in off the ravine muted sound, making every step echo as if the forest were expanding, stretching time itself. I tried to focus on breathing clearly, but the scream returned, this time interspersed with words or sounds that resembled words, unintelligible, urgent, filled with a warning I couldn't decode. My mind struggled to rationalize, but rational thought had been abandoned the moment I had stepped into the wind tunnel, the moment the forest had marked me. I found a small outcrop and climbed onto it, hoping for a vantage point. The wind screamed louder here, funneling through the rocks in a way that made the air vibrate against my chest. And then I saw it, or rather glimpsed it, a shadow moving between the cliffs, faster than any human, slinking, twisting in a way that defied gravity. My flashlight caught it for an instant, a blur of dark limbs, a face I never got a full look at, eyes reflecting faint light like coals. My stomach dropped, and I stumbled back, scrambling over rock and root. That single glimpse was enough. I knew this was not a prankster or a lost hiker. There was an intelligence in that movement, a malevolent curiosity that felt like it had been waiting decades for someone like me to wander too far, too late, too unprepared. I made it back to my camper, chest heaving, hands shaking, but the wind followed. Even as I closed the door, the scream threaded itself into the canvas, rattling the walls, vibrating through the floorboards, refusing to be ignored. I sat there, listening to the night, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the small circle of lantern light. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, I could no longer tell. The forest had stolen my sense of time, and with it, my peace of mind. When sleep finally claimed me, it was shallow, fragmented by whispers, by the wind's wailing lament, by the occasional thud against the camper that made my muscles tighten in anticipation. By morning, the gorge appeared benign, almost picturesque in the pale November light. Fallen leaves lay undisturbed, the cliffs gleamed faintly in the weak sun, and the wind had softened to a gentle hum. I stepped outside cautiously, flashlight in hand, scanning the area for signs of the night's events. Nothing. No tracks, no disturbances, no hint of what had moved through the darkness. Only the memory remained, carved into my mind with sharp precision, the scream, the shadow, the feeling of being watched, of the forest itself being alive in a way that humans could never comprehend. I packed slowly, senses alert, each snap of a twig or distant bird call twisting my gut into knots. Driving away from Red River Gorge, the image of that dark figure lingered, refusing to fade. The wind seemed to follow me down the narrow roads, whispering in the same guttural rhythm, carrying lessons I would never fully articulate. I learned that night that fear is not just a reaction. It's a presence, a consciousness woven into the world around us, waiting for us to notice, to respect, to survive. I have returned since then once or twice, but never alone, never at night, never expecting the gorge to welcome me the same way. Some places hold more than memory. They hold echoes, shadows, and warnings that ripple through the very air. Red River Gorge, in November, carries all three, and I would not tempt it lightly again. Even days later, the memory of that night clung to me like frost on the windshield, sharp, persistent, impossible to shake. I kept replaying it in my head over and over, trying to pinpoint where fear ended and instinct began, trying to tell myself that the forest had only used my imagination against me. But imagination doesn't leave footprints. Imagination doesn't bend the wind into a voice that feels like it knows your name. I walked the familiar trails in daylight, hoping the sun's clarity would erase the shadows that had haunted me. But each tree seemed to lean a little differently, each cliff a little closer, as if the gorge remembered. I realized that night wasn't just an anomaly, it was a lesson, one that demanded attention, one that would not release me until I understood the boundaries I had crossed. I returned home, but the world outside the forest felt foreign. The hum of traffic, the fluorescent lighting, the chatter of people at cafes, it all seemed muted, artificial, a weak imitation of the life I had left in the woods. My mind still traced the spiral of wind, the shape of that shadow, the scream that wasn't a scream, and I realized that some fears don't leave when you leave the place. They come with you, embedded deep, waiting to remind you that the unknown is patient, and it waits in the dark corners of memory as much as in the cliffs and hollows. Nights were the hardest. Alone in my apartment, the wind outside my window would twist against the glass in ways that mimicked that scream, and my chest would tighten with the same warning I had felt at Red River Gorge. You were not alone, and the forest has not forgotten. I began to study the gorge in a way I had never done before, talking to locals, reading old journals and reports of disappearances and strange occurrences. There were countless stories, half dismissed as legend, half whispered as truth. Hikers who vanished without trace, lights in the distance that moved with intelligence, howls that sounded almost human. One elderly man told me something that stayed with me more than anything. The gorge doesn't just have trails. It has memories. It remembers who walks through it, and sometimes it responds. At first, I laughed at the poetic warning, but I knew better. I had felt the response firsthand. I had been marked, however subtly, by a night that had no clear beginning or end. Weeks later, I returned, but not to the same campsite. I wanted to see if fear was real or merely a shadow of my own mind. This time, I took a friend, someone whose calm presence might anchor me. The moment we crossed into the gorge, I felt it again. The subtle shift in air, the low hum in the trees, the way the wind seemed to coil around the cliffs instead of passing through. My friend, unaware of the night I had endured, joked about ghost stories and haunted forests, but I could not joke. I could only watch, listen, and respect the force that had claimed my attention that November night. The sun dipped early that day, and the shadows deepened faster than anticipated. We stopped to set up camp near a small clearing, far enough from the cliffs to feel a semblance of safety. For hours, the forest was quiet, too quiet. Then came the first sound, soft, distant, almost pleading. I froze mid-step, scanning the edge of the tree line. My friend heard nothing. The wind shifted and carried the sound closer, a haunting echo that felt layered, as if multiple voices had been folded into one. And then the movement. A shadow slithering along the far edge of the clearing, stopping and starting, moving in ways that defied normal gait. My heart hammered against my ribs, my mind screaming that this was the same presence from before. The gorge was alive again, responding, testing, reminding me of its rules. I realized then that fear is not merely reaction, it is awareness. It forces you to see beyond the veil of normality, to acknowledge that some spaces are not made for comfort, for human arrogance, for the assumption that the world is predictable. The figure did not approach, it circled, observed, calculating. I did not speak. I did not move. My friend, still unaware, asked if I was all right, and I nodded, though my voice trembled. That night, sleep came again in fragments, each broken by distant shrieks, the wind's twisting lament, and the sensation of being examined, measured, judged by something older than trees, older than stone, older than any human fear could fully contain. In the morning, as pale light spilled over the gorge, I traced every detail of the previous night. There were no signs, no traces, nothing to prove the presence had ever been real, except in the imprint it left on my senses. The forest seemed to sigh, softening, almost benign in the daylight, but the memory of it lingered as a quiet echo in the bones. I realized that some lessons of the woods are not meant to be spoken. They are to be felt, carried, and respected. You do not conquer the forest. You observe, you survive, and you leave it in the condition it allows. Since that November, I have camped less recklessly, always considering the intelligence of the place, the patience of the wind, the echo of shadows that wait until you are alone. But fear, I learned, is not a weakness. It is a mirror. It reflects your limits, your understanding, your humility. That night at Red River Gorge taught me more than any hike, any map, any guidebook ever could. The scream of the wind, the shadow in the trees, the deliberate awareness of a forest older than time, it all exists to remind us that nature is not merely backdrop. It is a living, breathing entity that remembers, and sometimes it speaks. Even now, months later, I still hear that faint echo in the quiet moments. When the wind shifts just right against the cliffs near my hometown, when the streetlights flicker and the leaves skitter across asphalt, I am reminded of a night that changed the way I walk in the world. The forest taught me that courage is not absence of fear. It is awareness of what is real and respect for it. It is understanding that some experiences will leave a mark, not on your skin, but on your mind, your perception, the way you measure reality. I will never return to that exact spot alone. I will never forget the scream. I will never doubt that the gorge speaks and that it listens. Red River Gorge remains in my mind as it is in life, a cathedral of stone and wind, a monument to the unknown, and a reminder that even the bravest among us can be humbled by the pulse of the natural world. That night, in the screaming wind tunnel, I learned that fear can be a guide, horror a teacher, and survival not just a matter of skill, but of attention, respect, and patience. Some nights in the forest are not about stories we tell, they are about truths we endure, and the wind carries them, echoing forever between the cliffs. And when the wind howls just so, I listen, and I remember that night, and I am changed. The forest never truly sleeps, not here in the Appalachian Mountains near Hot Springs, North Carolina, where the laurel bushes grow thick and the shadows cling like a second skin. I learned that on a humid August evening in 2019, when the air felt heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine, and the sun had already begun to slump behind the ridges, leaving a dim, gray twilight in its wake. My name is Marcus, I'm 32, and I've been chasing the solitude of the woods for years, often camping alone in the quieter corners where the trail narrows, where the streams murmur secrets no one else hears. But that night, solitude carried a weight I had never anticipated, a feeling that pressed on my chest and turned each step into something deliberate, cautious, aware. I had pitched my small green tent in a clearing off the main Appalachian Trail, where the laurel bushes formed a natural wall behind my camp. The path here was less traveled, a rough stretch where fallen branches tangled like sleeping serpents, where the wind whispered through the trees with an almost sentient patience. I had been hiking for hours, climbing the slopes under a sky mottled with clouds, my backpack heavy with essentials and a few comforts, a small camping stove, a thermos of strong coffee, a worn journal. I remember feeling that rare, almost sacred calm, that deep exhale you get when you finally sink into a place that feels untouched, as though you've stepped outside the world's noise. And yet, even as I set up camp, there was a prickling at the base of my skull, subtle and insistent, like the prelude to a storm that hasn't yet spoken its thunder. By the time night fell, I had lit a small fire, its flames licking the darkness and painting the laurel leaves with shades of gold and orange. I was cooking a simple meal, listening to the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of some nocturnal creature in the underbrush. Then I noticed it, almost too faint to trust. A pair of eyes, reflecting the firelight, watching me from the thick brush about 20 feet from my clearing. My pulse kicked in, immediate and sharp, and I froze mid-stir, staring into the darkness. They were too steady, too deliberate to belong to a deer, too intense for any animal I knew. My first instinct was to dismiss it, a trick of the light, shadows dancing, but the gaze persisted. Long moments passed before I forced myself to speak. A low, cautious hello, no response, just the silence of the woods, thick and expectant, punctuated by the occasional crackle of my fire. I packed away my cooking gear slowly, each motion deliberate, as though any sudden movement might provoke whatever was watching me. The eyes never blinked. The hair on my arms prickled, my skin felt impossibly thin under the scrutiny. Something about the way the gaze seemed to study me, to weigh me, was unnerving. It wasn't just the fear of an unknown presence. It was the recognition that I was being observed in a way that stripped away privacy and pretense. I realized, with a creeping horror, that I had been hiking alone, confident in my solitude, yet utterly unprepared for the feeling of being someone else's focus in this darkened wilderness. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it toward the laurel bush. The light caught leaves, twisted branches, and a shadow that darted too quickly for my eyes to follow. My heart thumped violently. I tried to tell myself it was a raccoon, maybe a lost dog, or even another hiker pulling a late-night prank, but the air seemed to vibrate with something else, something unspoken. The forest had taken on a different rhythm. Each snapping twig sounded like a footstep, every shifting breeze like whispered voices. I wanted to move, to retreat into my tent, but a stubborn curiosity anchored me in place. I had hiked these mountains enough to know the difference between animal and human presence, and this was neither clearly. There was intention here. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time twisted strangely. I kept glancing toward the laurel bushes, every glimpse igniting the same icy sensation down my spine. The eyes disappeared at some point, slipping into the shadows like smoke, yet their memory lingered in the way the forest felt thinner in certain spots, almost hollow, as if something unseen moved just beyond sight. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams stitched from whispers, low growls, and the metallic scent of fear. When I woke, my flashlight had fallen to the ground, casting a circle of dim, trembling light across the tent walls. I could hear a faint shuffling outside, just beyond the fire's reach. I dared not look immediately, fearing what I might find, yet unable to ignore it. When I finally unzipped the tent flap, nothing was there. No footprints, no shadows, no trace, only the laurel leaves quivering gently in the wind, carrying the faint odor of wet soil and decay. I packed up quickly, moving along the trail with a heightened sense of hyper-awareness, my every step calculated. The forest that had once welcomed me now felt charged, alive with hidden eyes, unseen mouths breathing behind every cluster of bushes. The encounter forced me to confront a truth I had skirted in my solitary expeditions. The woods do not belong to you. You may walk within them, you may sleep beneath their canopy, but they observe, remember, and respond in ways you cannot predict. Even in areas where maps mark trails and campsites, the wilderness retains its autonomy, and intruding upon it carries a subtle, invisible reckoning. By mid-morning, the dense shadows of the laurel thinned with the sun's ascent, revealing the trail in clearer relief. Yet the sensation lingered, the feeling of being watched, measured, considered. I had to tell someone, even if only in writing, to make sense of the night's events. Sitting on a fallen log, I opened my journal and began to write, each word a tether to reality, the shape of the eyes, the intensity, the timing, the sensation of intention. Reflection brought no comfort, only a deeper respect for the silence of the mountains and the creatures that inhabit them, human and otherwise. I realized that fear is not always about the immediate threat. Sometimes it is about the recognition that we are never truly alone, that the world carries a consciousness beyond our comprehension, and that certain encounters leave permanent echoes in the psyche. The experience reshaped my approach to camping in the Appalachians. I learned to honor the boundaries of the wild, to observe with humility, and to recognize the subtle signals of presence before they escalate into something unmanageable. I now hike with an unspoken reverence for the unseen, maintaining awareness without descending into paranoia. I share this story not to frighten for entertainment's sake, but to instill a deep-seated respect for the layered consciousness of the forest, and to remind anyone venturing into these mountains that vigilance and mindfulness are not just practical, they are survival. Even now, years later, I recall the August night near Hot Springs with a shiver. I can close my eyes and see the eyes in the laurel bushes burning faintly with a reflection of the fire, and feel again that chilling realization that in the deep woods, observation is constant, and the watcher may be closer than we imagine. The experience taught me a quiet lesson in humility and presence, in attuning to what the forest wants to reveal rather than imposing my narrative upon it. And as I recount it, walking once more among the ridges and streams, I carry forward that knowledge, alert to the shifting shadows and the ever-present gaze that belongs not to me, but to the eternal wilderness that surrounds us. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I pressed deeper along the trail, my steps cautious, almost ceremonial, as if each footfall could summon the presence I had glimpsed the night before. The laurel bushes became more than vegetation. They were a living, watching barrier, their leaves whispering secrets I could not yet understand. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck lift with every rustle of the underbrush, every faint creak of an unseen branch. Somewhere, deep in the shadows, a movement stirred, deliberate yet fluid, never fully revealing itself. It was not just fear anymore. It was an acute awareness of the thin boundary between observer and observed, a realization that the forest itself had agency, that it responded to me as much as I responded to it. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to spill gold across the moss and fern, but the laurel thickets retained pockets of shadow that seemed to pulse with hidden life. I paused by a small creek, its water crystal clear but cold, and knelt to drink, letting the sound of the running water anchor me. The stillness was deceptive. I sensed the eyes again, not in front but from the periphery, the corners of the trail where light barely penetrated. They did not blink, did not shift. They merely existed, and in their existence they communicated a warning, a question, an expectation I could not decipher. I wanted to leave, to abandon the path, yet a strange insistence pulled me forward, as if understanding could only come through endurance, through presence. The air grew heavier as the afternoon wore on. A sudden breeze carried a scent I could not place, metallic, pungent like iron on stone. My steps slowed. Every snapping twig or falling leaf jolted my senses. And then I heard it, a faint, deliberate footfall, separate from my own, almost synchronized, echoing my pace but never overtaking it. My breath hitched. I stopped completely, heart pounding, listening. The sound mirrored me for a few moments, then vanished, leaving only the quiet hum of the creek and the wind brushing through the canopy. My rational mind wanted to insist it was an animal, a hiker, the play of echoes in the narrow valley. But the primal part of me, the part that had felt the eyes, knew otherwise. Someone, or something, had been walking alongside me, unseen but present, like a shadow with its own consciousness. Night approached again faster than I expected. I found a small ledge above the trail, a natural perch overlooking a curve in the mountain, and decided to set up a temporary rest. As I built a small fire, I noticed the laurel bushes below quivering, not from wind, for the air was still, but from something moving within. And then I saw them. Faint reflections of light, not from my fire, dancing at the edges of the thickets. They moved deliberately, circling, observing, never breaking the veil completely. My mind raced. Wild thoughts of intruders, of dangerous animals, of some natural predator, but deep down I knew this was different. The eyes were intelligent. There was purpose here, and it was not bound by the physical laws I relied upon in daylight. The night became a study in tension, in perception, sharpened to a painful degree. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, each gust of wind carried meaning. I ate in silence, my hands trembling slightly, aware of every shadow cast by my small fire. Sleep was impossible. Even lying in my tent, I felt the pressure of observation, the sensation of being measured, of being catalogued in ways I could not comprehend. At some point, I understood a terrifying yet beautiful truth. The forest was alive with consciousness, not just of animals, not just of the wind and trees, but of something older, sharper, more aware than myself. And I, who had come seeking adventure and solitude, was now humbled, reminded of my place in the vast, watching wilderness. I emerged the next morning, exhausted, the first rays of sunlight slicing through the mist like knives. The laurel bushes had returned to their silent, passive state, yet the memory of their eyes remained, a lingering pressure at the edges of perception. I hiked faster, descending the ridges toward Hot Springs, yet even as the town appeared on the horizon, I could not shake the feeling of being followed, not physically, but in memory, in presence, as though the forest had imprinted itself on my consciousness. Every trail I would walk thereafter, every night spent under canvas, carried echoes of that encounter. The eyes from the laurel bushes had taught me that fear is not always immediate, that respect for the wild is not merely caution, but awareness of its omnipresence. I tell this story now not as a warning or thrill, but as an invocation to those who seek the woods, to tread lightly, to observe deeply, and to listen beyond the obvious. The Appalachian Mountains are alive, layered with histories, presences, and consciousness we cannot fully name. The laurel bushes near Hot Springs in August 2019 held more than leaves and branches. They held a reminder of vigilance, humility, and reverence. For every step into the forest, there is a response. For every moment alone, there is a witness. And in that quiet, in the tense and suspended nights, we learn our most essential truths, not from what we conquer, but from what quietly watches, always, from the shadows. Even now, when I hike these ridges or camp in the silence of a hidden clearing, I feel the weight of that gaze. It lingers in the corners of my mind, in the flutter of leaves, in the subtle shifts of shadow and light. I have learned through that unnerving presence that fear need not be destructive. It can be instructive. It can sharpen perception, expand awareness, and instill a profound connection to the world beyond ourselves. And as I recount this story, I am not simply remembering an encounter. I am honoring it, recognizing the forest as a teacher and the eyes from the laurel bushes as the most patient and exacting of guides. The mountains hold many secrets, many eyes, many lessons for those willing to walk quietly and watch intently. What I carry from that August night is a recognition that solitude is never empty, that the wild has a memory, and that every rustle of leaves, every hidden gaze, every moment of stillness is a dialogue. And in that dialogue, I have found something far more powerful than fear, a connection to the living, breathing spirit of the Appalachians, and a respect for the unseen that will remain with me for the rest of my days. The wind had a way of whispering secrets through the spruce and fir trees at Dolly Sods, secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. It was June 2022, and I had set out alone, a 29-year-old wanderer craving the solitude only the highlands of West Virginia could offer. My name is Jordan. I grew up near the lowland rivers, far from mountains that scraped the sky, but the Appalachians had always called me with a pull that felt almost magnetic. I had driven past the familiar towns, past the dusty turnoffs, until the asphalt dissolved into gravel and the gravel into the soft hum of pine needles underfoot. I set my sights on an unmarked campsite I had scouted on old maps, a place the locals whispered about in half-fearful tones, a clearing that had no signs, No evidence of human presence, only the hollowed echo of past wanderers who may or may not have returned. I pitched my tent where the moss was thick and the ground damp, where the scent of cold stone and deep forest mingled with the sharp tang of wet leaves, and I felt at once both welcome and unwelcome. Night fell like a curtain, the sky bleeding into ink, and the stars scattered themselves in violent clarity above. I had brought a fire, but I kept it low, small, almost apologetic, as though the flames themselves might wake something I did not want to meet. I was used to the woods, to the eerie silences between the hoots of owls and the distant snap of limbs under some hidden creature. But that night, even the usual orchestration of nocturnal life seemed to bend around me, stretching, twisting into sounds I could not place. At first, I thought it was the wind. That seemed plausible. But then I noticed subtle signs, the faint brush of movement beyond the firelight, the occasional crunch of leaves in a rhythm too careful to belong to an animal. My heart thudded against my ribs with a primal rhythm, the way it does when you are alone and the forest is no longer merely beautiful, but watchful. I tried to tell myself that people often overestimate the danger of empty woods, that the human mind seeks to dramatize the unknown. And yet, as I lay in my sleeping bag, the shadows stretching like living things along the canvas of my tent, I felt a presence. It was patient, deliberate, the kind of presence that knows you are aware but does not yet reveal itself. I would catch a glimpse of movement when I looked up, a silhouette in the corner of my vision that disappeared the moment my eyes turned fully toward it. My instincts screamed at me to light the fire brighter, to pack up and leave. But there was a stubborn part of me that had come for this very intensity, this brush with the uncharted. And so I remained, pretending to sleep as the night pressed in. Around midnight, the sound changed. The footsteps, if that is what they were, became slower, heavier, careful not to disturb the undergrowth more than necessary. They circled my campsite, pausing near the edge where my little fire fought against the dark. I held my breath, feeling the heat of my own fear more than the cold night. My hand moved subtly toward my backpack where I kept a flashlight, and I debated for long seconds whether to confront it or to wait and observe. That is when I noticed the scent, sharp, metallic, mingled with the damp rot of fallen wood. It was a smell that should have had no place here, and yet it clung to the air like a warning. I forced myself to sit up, letting the firelight illuminate my face. I whispered into the silence, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded absurdly loud, overconfident in the stillness that pressed against me. There was no reply, only the shuffle of leaves, a footstep skimming the edge of the circle of light, a deliberate avoidance that was almost mocking. I could see a shadow stretching along the trunks of the trees, tall, thin, indistinct. My instincts screamed to grab my gear and bolt, but a strange fascination held me there, anchored to the possibility of encountering someone or something that did not belong to the daylit world. Then it happened. A branch snapped, closer now, just beyond the firelight. The sound was sudden, intimate, like the brush of a hand on bark. My pulse slammed in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight, letting the beam cut through the night in jagged slices. There was nothing, only the empty forest, but the feeling of being watched did not lift. In fact, it intensified, pressing down on me from every direction, a weight that was almost physical. My mind raced with questions I could not answer. Was it a trespasser, a local camper testing their nerve, or something older, something that belonged to the wilderness itself? The thought of that last possibility sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to step outside the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. Each footstep was muffled against the moss, but I could hear my own heart, loud enough to echo against the trees. The flashlight beam cut through the fog that had begun to settle, revealing only twisted roots, hanging moss, and the occasional glimmer of something that could almost be eyes, but was not. I turned in a slow circle, scanning, trying to impose human logic on the impossible. And then I saw it. A figure, just a silhouette at the edge of the clearing, no discernible features, standing so still it could have been part of the trees. It tilted its head slightly, as though studying me, and in that instant the boundary between the forest and something otherworldly felt thinner than paper. Fear gave way to a tense, cold clarity. I realized that my own presence, my own curiosity, had invited this encounter. I spoke softly, deliberately, "I'm not here to hurt you. I don't want trouble." The words seemed ridiculous in the silent expanse, yet the figure shifted ever so slightly and retreated to the shadows, melting into the dark folds of the wilderness. I did not follow. I did not pursue. There was no heroism in chasing the unknown, only recklessness, and the forest has a long memory for those who overstep. I retreated to my tent, locked myself inside, and let the fire burn low, but I did not sleep that night. I listened to the whispers of the wind, now a chorus of voices, or perhaps the echo of my own mind, questioning the limits of human understanding, the fragile boundary between safety and peril. When dawn broke, I emerged cautiously, half expecting to find traces of the visitor. There was none, only the clearing, pristine and untouched, as though it had never been haunted at all. I packed up my camp, my mind racing, not with relief, but with a profound sense of humility. The encounter had not left scars, at least not visible ones, but it left a mark in the way I walked through the world afterward. Careful, respectful, aware that some places hold truths and presences that do not yield to casual inspection. The lesson was clear. Fear is not merely the absence of safety, but an acknowledgement of the vast unseen forces that exist alongside us. Even now, months later, I can feel the echo of that night. I can feel the brush of the unseen against my consciousness, the silent reminder that the wilderness is alive, not only in its trees and rivers, but in its mysteries, its watchers, but its subtle intimations of danger. I tell this story not to glorify fear, nor to embellish what occurred, but to remind those who wander, who seek the solitude and raw intensity of the woods, that respect is as crucial as courage. The forest, in its deep, enduring way, teaches lessons you will not hear from any trail guide or book, lessons about patience, presence, and the thin line between curiosity and peril. I left Dolly Sods that morning with the weight of unseen eyes still upon me, a presence that had tested the boundaries of my understanding. It was not terror in its purest form, but a deep existential recognition that the world is vaster, stranger, and far more complex than our daily lives allow us to perceive. Every rustle, every shifting shadow, every silent breath of wind became a reminder that we are not alone in the quiet places, that even when we cannot see them, something watches, evaluates, and endures. And that knowledge, raw and unfiltered, is the kind that seeps into your bones, altering the way you walk through both forest and life. The next day, as I hiked down the ridge toward the gravel roads that led back to civilization, the forest felt different, not less wild, but more deliberate, as if it had taken note of my passage. Every step seemed to echo differently, and every clearing I passed carried the faint residue of that night's encounter, like a whisper that refused to leave. I kept looking over my shoulder, not out of fear, but out of a strange sense of respect, as though acknowledging an invisible presence that had claimed its boundaries. I realized then that fear and reverence are two sides of the same coin in the wilderness. To ignore one is to disrespect the other, and the forest does not forgive ignorance lightly. By the time I reached the gravel road, my limbs ached from the tension of constant vigilance, yet my mind was alive in ways it hadn't been in years. I stopped at a small stream to drink, the water cold and pure, and I watched my reflection ripple in the current. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I had imagined the entire episode, if exhaustion and isolation had conjured phantoms in the night. But then a shiver ran through me, a memory of that still, observing silhouette, the weight of its gaze, and I knew it had been real. Real in the sense that matters. It had changed me. It had tested me. And I had survived, not by force or courage alone, but by awareness, patience, and a willingness to confront the unknown without attempting to dominate it. Later, as I recounted the experience to locals in the small mountain town nearby, I saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes. Some called it an encounter with a wanderer spirit. Others suggested a hermit, someone who had chosen the deep woods for solitude. And some simply shook their heads, murmuring that Dolly Sods has a way of reminding people they are never truly alone. Their words did little to comfort me or explain the encounter. Instead, they reinforced a truth I had already begun to understand. The world is full of things we cannot categorize, spirits that defy easy naming, presences that slip between the cracks of our comprehension, and perhaps the only way to navigate them is with humility, respect, and the awareness that every forest holds secrets, every campsite has its history, and every step we take may brush against something unseen but deeply felt. That night, back in a cabin rented on the edge of the wilderness, I found myself unable to sleep. I stared out the window at the distant ridge, tracing the contours of the trees against the moonlit sky. My mind replayed the encounter endlessly, the way the figure had shifted, the silence that had screamed louder than any sound, the tension that stretched across the clearing like a living thing. I understood something fundamental. Fear is not the opposite of courage. It is its companion, a guide that sharpens perception, heightens intuition, and forces us to confront our limits. And the forest, so alive, so indifferent, so ancient, offers these lessons not out of malice, but out of the inevitability of its own rhythms, testing those who dare enter its depths. I returned to that clearing several weeks later, not to chase the unknown, but to acknowledge it. I left offerings of water and a small token, gestures almost childish in their simplicity, yet profoundly necessary. The winds stirred through the spruce and fir as if responding, and for a brief moment the forest felt like an old friend, a teacher, a silent observer of all my missteps and discoveries. I understood then that encounters like this one are not meant to be conquered or rationalized. They are to be felt, absorbed, and respected. They imprint themselves on the soul, linger in memory, and shape the way we approach the unknown in the wilderness and beyond. Since that summer, every camping trip, every hike into remote places carries with it a deeper awareness. I notice the subtle shifts in the wind, the almost imperceptible changes in shadow, the way a clearing can feel welcoming one day and watchful the next. I have come to understand that the forest does not simply exist. It observes, remembers, and communicates in ways that transcend language and reason. And the unmarked campsite at Dolly Sods, with its silent, patient visitor, remains a benchmark in my life, a reminder that the world is more complex, more alive, and more mysterious than the human mind often allows itself to believe. I share this story not for shock or spectacle, but for the quiet revelation it offers. That true adventure is not found in conquering terrain or surviving danger, but in embracing the unknown, standing still amid fear, and recognizing the invisible forces that shape our reality. To enter the wilderness is to enter a dialogue with something vast and ancient, something that does not answer to our understanding, and something that demands a respect born of both courage and humility. And sometimes that dialogue leaves us unsettled, perhaps forever changed, yet profoundly more aware of the fragile, beautiful balance between human curiosity and the enduring power of the natural world. When I speak of Dolly Sods now, I do so with reverence. I tell this story to remind those who wander that fear is not the enemy. It is a guide, a signal, a teacher in its own right. It instructs us to move carefully, to observe deeply, and to honor the silent presences that inhabit the shadows. Some nights when I close my eyes, I still feel the brush of those unseen eyes upon me, and I smile, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. The encounter did not end. It merely became a part of me, a quiet pulse in the rhythm of my own life. It is a lesson I carry into every journey, every moment of solitude, and every step beyond the known path. Dolly Sods taught me that the forest is never empty, that the unmarked campsite may always harbor watchers, and that the lines between what we perceive and what is real are thinner than we dare imagine. It taught me that the deepest terror is not found in monsters or ghosts, but in the humbling recognition of our own smallness and vulnerability within a world that continues patiently and unyieldingly, regardless of our presence. And it reminded me that the wilderness is both teacher and test, a mirror of our courage, our respect, and our willingness to confront the unknown without succumbing to recklessness or fear. Even now, when I speak the name Dolly Sods, a shiver traces the line of my spine, a subtle echo of that night, that visitor, that presence that defied explanation. It is a story that lingers like a footprint in soft earth, like a shadow at the edge of perception, a story that asks those who listen to honor the forest, respect its inhabitants, and embrace the wildness that exists not only around us, but within us. For those who wander, who seek the silence between trees, who dare to step into the unmarked, the message is simple, yet profound. The forest will teach you if you listen, if you observe, if you are brave enough to acknowledge the fear that accompanies understanding. And so, the unmarked campsite at Dolly Sods Wilderness remains in my memory, a sacred place of encounter, reflection, and transformation. I tell this story to anyone who will listen, to those who crave the thrill of solitude and the weight of genuine primal fear, to those who wish to step beyond the boundaries of the familiar. Remember, the forest is alive in ways we cannot always see, and every step we take within it carries the potential for revelation, for caution, and for the haunting, unshakable awareness that some visitors, seen or unseen, linger long after we have left. The wind had a way of speaking up here, high on Mount Mitchell, whispering secrets through the pines and rattling the thin aluminum walls of our tents. I remember the first night clearly, the way the shadows shifted as if they were alive, how the moonlight seemed too deliberate, casting forms that lingered even after I blinked. My name is Alex, 27 at the time, and I've hiked and camped enough in the Appalachian Mountains to know the difference between ordinary wilderness sounds and the ones that crawl under your skin. But nothing could have prepared us for what April 2021 had in store. My friends and I, 3 locals from Asheville who had grown up wandering these mountains, decided to challenge the high camp trail at Mount Mitchell, seeking the solitude and raw beauty only the high elevations could provide. We were seasoned, confident, and foolish, in ways you only realize after the forest has taught you a lesson you won't soon forget. We arrived at dusk, backpacks heavy with supplies and expectations, the forest around us stretching in a silent, infinite green. The trail wound upward, damp and uneven, soaked from a week of spring rains. I remember the smell of wet pine needles, the earthy musk of damp rocks, and the faint, almost metallic scent of ice melt running down the ridges. We set up camp just below the summit, a modest clearing that had once been a lookout point for forest rangers. The view was staggering, a sea of rolling mountains, fading into the distance under a soft veil of mist. But that beauty belied the unease in the air, an intangible weight pressing on our chests that none of us could name. The first sign was subtle. A movement at the edge of our camp, something black slipping between the trees, fast enough to be a trick of the eye. We laughed it off, attributing it to a deer or a raccoon, the usual nocturnal wanderers. But as night deepened, the forest grew quieter, unnaturally so. Even the wind seemed hesitant. Around midnight, when the campfire had dwindled to glowing embers, one of my friends, Mara, froze mid-step, her gaze fixed on the trail we had hiked in from. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Her voice was taut, almost breaking under the weight of the fear she hadn't yet named. We followed her eyes and saw it, a shadow crossing the trail, swift, fluid, impossibly large. It moved without the sound of footsteps, without rustling leaves, and it didn't look like any animal we had ever encountered. For a long moment, none of us dared breathe. It was like watching a void glide through the world of light we had carved with our fire. The shadow returned, not once, but several times, each pass lingering longer, as if testing us. My hands were shaking, though I tried to convince myself I was just cold, that the adrenaline was exaggerating every sense. The animals that had once signaled life, owls, raccoons, deer, were gone. Silence pressed on us, not gentle or natural, but deliberate, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Mara clutched a flashlight, pointing it toward the trail, but the beam only revealed empty space, though the shadow had been unmistakable. I could feel it, a presence, intelligent and patient, like something that had been observing for hours, maybe days, maybe centuries. We debated leaving immediately, retreating down the trail into the safety of lower elevations, but the forest had other plans. The trail we had hiked earlier seemed altered, subtle but undeniable. Roots appeared where they hadn't been, rocks shifted slightly, and the familiar landmarks were distorted in the dim glow of our flashlights. Panic began to ripple through the group. I tried to mask my own fear, reminding myself that mountains play tricks on the mind at night, that shadows stretch and bend in ways our eyes can't reconcile. But then, the shadow appeared again, closer this time, moving across a slope directly in front of us, and with it came a sensation, a whisper that threaded itself through the mind, not spoken aloud but understood. Leave. We followed instinct, backing slowly, taking care not to make noise, our breaths shallow and synchronized with the faint sound of the wind through the needles. Every step seemed amplified, every crack of a branch underfoot resonating through the stillness. And yet, the shadow did not pursue in the way a predator might. It lingered on the ridge above us, gliding just beyond reach, watching, unhurried, waiting for us to make the next mistake. The forest, which had once felt familiar and protective, had transformed into a maze of uncertainty. Every direction felt like a risk, every glance over our shoulders a potential confrontation with the unknown. By the time the first hint of dawn bled over the horizon, we were exhausted, frozen not by cold alone, but by the weight of uncertainty pressing on our shoulders. The shadow had disappeared, retreating to wherever it belonged, leaving only a memory of movement and the lingering sensation of being observed. We packed silently, voices minimal, and descended the trail without daring to look back. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made our hearts leap. And when we finally emerged onto the lower elevations, greeted by the first signs of morning life, chirping birds, the rustle of squirrels, we felt both relief and disbelief. We had survived, yes, but the shadow had left its mark, an invisible scar on our understanding of the wilderness. Even now, months later, the memory haunts me. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. The deep, visceral knowledge that there are places in these mountains where the ordinary rules do not apply, where a camper's confidence, no matter how hard-earned, is fragile against the patient intelligence of something that watches from the dark. I learned in those hours frozen at Mount Mitchell High Camp that fear is not just an emotion, but a guide, a reminder that respect for the unknown is not optional. We returned home with stories we dare not repeat in detail, each of us forever attuned to the shadows that move just beyond the trail, in places where the wind whispers too perfectly and the night feels alive. Even as we drove away from the trailhead, the mountains receded behind us like a dark memory refusing to fade. I could feel the eyes of the forest lingering on the rearview mirror, or perhaps it was just my mind struggling to make sense of something that had no rational explanation. Mara, usually fearless and sharp-witted, remained unusually silent, her fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. There was no need to speak. We all knew we had crossed into a space where human expectation held no sway, where the shadows dictated the rhythm and scale of fear. Over the following days, every phone call, every casual glance out the window carried the echo of that silent watcher. Even the sounds of the city seemed hollow compared to the oppressive quiet of that night on the high trail. What haunted me most, though, was not the shadow itself, but the way it had made us confront our own limitations. We had entered the wilderness with a sense of mastery, maps, gear, experience. But the moment that dark presence slipped across the trail, all of that confidence evaporated. It was a humbling, almost spiritual lesson, the kind that leaves your chest tight and your mind restless long after the event. I realized that fear in the mountains isn't always about survival in the physical sense. Sometimes it's about understanding that we are temporary, fragile, and often unaware guests in a world that existed long before us and will persist long after we are gone. In the following weeks, I tried to rationalize what we had experienced. Maybe it was a bear moving with unnatural stealth, or perhaps a trick of moonlight on the fogged ridges. But the more I replayed it in my mind, the more impossible the rational explanation seemed. The shadow had been deliberate. It had waited, studied, tested us. And in testing us, it had revealed something deeper, our own susceptibility to fear, to the unknown, to the unseen currents that ripple just beyond perception. I began to notice similar patterns on lower trails in less extreme environments. The sudden stillness when something unseen passes nearby, the subtle distortions in the air that make the forest seem alive in ways that cannot be measured. That night at Mount Mitchell taught me to listen differently, to move differently, to respect the unseen order of the woods. It was months later, hiking alone on a less traveled section of the Appalachian Trail, that I understood the full weight of what we had encountered. The memory of the shadow returned, not as terror, but as a quiet companion, reminding me that these mountains hold truths that cannot be contained by logic or reason. I could feel the forest around me breathe and pulse with life that does not require human acknowledgement. And somewhere, far above, on trails I might never hike again, the shadow moved with that same patience and vigilance, a guardian of the high ridges, a reminder that some forces are beyond fear and beyond understanding. Sharing this story now on this channel, No Name, I feel the weight of responsibility. Not to sensationalize, not to entertain with cheap frights, but to communicate the real, tangible respect these woods demand. For those who follow these trails, who pitch tents under the canopy of pines and stars, know that the mountains are alive with histories, presences, and forces that will watch, measure, and test you. There is wisdom in fear, strength in humility, and a lesson in every shadow that crosses your path. When the wind dies down and the night stretches endlessly, pay attention, not just to what you see, but to what you feel. That is where the truth resides. Even now, when I recount the night of the shadow crossing, the shiver returns, not out of panic, but out of recognition. I understand, more than ever, that the forest is patient, and so too must we be, careful with every step, conscious of our own place in the world of trees and stones. For anyone listening, let this be more than a story of fear. Let it be a caution, a guide, a companion as you navigate the wilderness. Respect the shadows, respect the silence, and above all, respect the trail you walk. Some nights, some presences cannot be outrun. They wait and they watch, teaching lessons no human book can convey, lessons that linger in the chest long after the fire has died and the dawn returns. When I think back on that April night, I realized that the true horror was not in what we saw, but in what we learned. That fear is both a barrier and a bridge. It warns us, yes, but it also opens the mind to awareness, to the delicate balance between human curiosity and natural law. On Mount Mitchell, we were reminded of our own insignificance, and yet, paradoxically, of our connection to something vast, eternal, and incomprehensibly watchful. The shadow crossing the trail was not just a threat. It was a teacher, silent but profound, leaving impressions etched into the mind in ways that stories alone cannot carry. And so when you set up camp in the high Appalachians, when you hear the whisper of wind threading through the branches, remember that the mountains are more than rock and pine. They are living spaces with memory and will, and sometimes they choose to reveal themselves in ways that cannot be ignored. Carry your awareness like a lantern in the dark. Trust in your preparation, but never forget the shadows. They move not with malice alone, but with purpose, and they remind us that even in fear, there is clarity, and in the quietest moments of terror, there is an education that can change the way you walk through the world forever.